Hello, everyone. I'm so pleased to welcome you all to this session as part of Climate Week. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy days to attend. My name is Neil Vora. I am a physician with Conservation International, where I help to implement environmental conservation solutions to improve human health. Prior to joining Conservation International, I worked for the US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention for nearly a decade, where I focused on outbreak response to emerging pathogens. This session is titled Planetary Health: Thriving Humans Can Lead to a Thriving Planet. We are currently witnessing massive environmental change around the world, from a changing climate to worsening air quality to collapsing fish populations. These changes make the state of the global environment indeed seem dire. Just look at the latest warnings from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which state that we are on track to have 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming within the next 2 decades. Then, of course, there is infectious disease emergence, which has been linked to environmental degradation. COVID-19 is the latest in a long line of novel infectious diseases to have recently emerged and has inflicted immeasurable suffering. The bottom line is that human activities are behind these environmental degradations that we are seeing globally. Indeed, as described by Sam Myers of Harvard, we are in a new geologic epoch called the Anthropocene, in which humans are the dominant force driving the planet's biophysical conditions. Particularly over the past century, many humans have participated in extensive resource extraction from the Earth. And this has certainly resulted in direct benefits to a large number of humans, such as longer life expectancy. But it seems that we are now reaching a tipping point in which the scales are beginning to flip. Right before our very eyes, we are witnessing how the declining global environment is now adversely impacting human well-being. And recognizing the linkages between human health and that of the Earth is what the fields of planetary health and One Health are all about. This is also the focus of today's conversation. I'm thrilled to now introduce our highly esteemed panel. These are people who are leaders in this field. Aaron Bernstein is the interim director of the Center for Climate, Health, and the Global Environment at the Harvard Chan School of Public Health. He's also a pediatrician at Boston's Children's Hospital and an assistant professor of pediatrics at Harvard Medical School. Ari focuses on the health impacts of the climate crisis on children's health and advancing solutions to address its causes to improve the health and well-being of children around the world. For fun, Ari likes to sit in forests, bike, and play with his boys. Hindu Umaru Ibrahim is an environmental activist and member of Chad's pastoralist Mbororo people. She is the founder of the Association for Indigenous Women and Peoples of Chad. She also serves as a UN Sustainable Development Goal advocate, Conservation International board member, and Earthshot Prize Council member. Hindu's work with Indigenous communities at the local and global level has achieved broad recognition and support, including the 2021 Rolex Award for Enterprise, the 2020 Refugee International's Holbrook Award, the 2019 Pritzker Emerging Environmental Genius Award, and the Daniel Mitterrand Prize. For fun, Hindu likes to scuba dive. And our third panelist is Dr. Kinnari Webb. Kinnari developed the vision for health and harmony on an undergraduate trip while studying orangutans in Indonesian Borneo in 1993. Kinnari graduated from Yale University School of Medicine with honors and then founded Health and Harmony in 2005 to support the combined human and environmental work that she envisioned. Kinnari recently wrote a book called Guardians of the Trees that will be released in the next week. Pre-pandemic, Kinnari liked to spend time between Indonesia, other international locations, and the San Francisco Bay Area. For fun, Kinnari enjoys hiking and playing with her 6-month-old son. Thank you, panelists, for joining us today, and thank you to the members of the audience for taking the time to join us today as well. Ari, let's start with you. We are in the midst of a pandemic. What is the connection between environmental degradation and infectious disease?
Thanks for that question, Neil, and thanks so much for having me. It's such an honor to share a panel with such incredibly distinguished individuals. I think you hit on this pretty well in your introduction. We know that we swim in a common germ pool with animals. And so when we come into contact with them, there's always a chance that a microbe can spill, as we call it, from an animal to a person. And that contact, that interface is really driven by human activities, whether it's taking down forests, harvesting animals for any number of uses, and other reasons. And so our demands upon nature come back in this spillover of pathogens. Now, most of the contact is, of course, harmless. Microbes get changed all the time, and every once in a while we get a COVID-19. In the case of COVID-19, to your question, it's not obviously totally clear how that virus got into people, but I would be pretty sure that at some point this virus started in an animal, and likely a bat, a horseshoe bat somewhere in Asia. And we've seen this before. This is a movie with sequels. We had SARS in 2003. That was pretty clearly from a horseshoe bat. We've had MERS, the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, also from a bat, another coronavirus. And so I think, we know coronaviruses live in bats. And again, we're placing high demands upon the forest habitats that many of these bats live in.
Kinnari, to follow up, beyond infectious diseases, in what other ways is human well-being related to the health of the planet? Maybe you can specifically talk about climate change and other environmental impacts on human well-being.
Just realized I was muted, sorry. The classic story is, they're damaged environments harm human health, and that's without question true. But the story is a little bit more complex. And when I went to Indonesia to study orangutans, I was totally surprised to discover that people who love and respect the forest and wanted the forest to be there for the long run often were forced to log when they didn't want to in order to access healthcare. And what we're finding is that's a quite common story throughout the tropics. And why do these communities have so few resources? Because of hundreds of years of colonialism, right? Resources have been taken from them, and then they have access, they have few other choices, and then they will log to pay for healthcare. One man I know cut down 60 giant rainforest trees to pay for a C-section. Another woman told me, if anyone tells you that they have not logged to pay for healthcare, they are lying to you, because that's the only way to get enough money. And she said, it takes 5 planks of wood just to get birth control each month, right? Like those are the kinds of choices that people are making often. And that we just cannot have. If we want a healthy planet, we need to understand that we are all in the same boat, and this boat is sinking. And we need to lovingly and with respect and honor and what I call radical listening, so that it is completely under the control and direction of rainforest communities. They determine what the solutions are. And then resources need to go to them to support them so they can give this incredible gift back to the world of protecting forest. And I'm sure Hindu has lots to say about this. So, yeah.
Well, let's turn to Hindu. Hindu, can you tell us more from your own personal experience how you and the community you grew up in have been affected by environmental degradation?
Sure, thank you very much, Neil. It's so great to be with you, Kinnari and Aaron, and hearing from really a medical doctor perspective. So, I grew up in the communities where there is no access to the hospitals. And of course, there is not access to the school, also to the supermarket. And when we talk about human health, we completely forget that access to the food also, it's part of the health body and health mental and all. So, with the climate change impact and loss of the biodiversity, we are seeing not only the broader impact, we don't have enough water or we don't have enough pastures. We are seeing how our first pharmacy, who is the medicine around the brood, that is disappearing. Most of the species that used to be there when I was young, and now they are not any longer there. And this degradation of the environment, it impacts also the animals, because our cattle used to graze different kind of the grass during each seasons. And that determines the quality of the milk that we can have, from the flavor from the all the vitamin that they can have, because as you know, when you have the milk, you have to get the butter. So when you have a quantity of the butter, so you know that exactly if it's impacting your health or not. So those quality of the grass, when they are disappearing, so it's impacting the quality of our milk and immediately impacting the children who can become malnutrition. And then of course, the human health is completely affected. And at the same time, when you are nomadic, you move from one place to another one, you understand your ecosystem and how you can live with your ecosystem. And during the rain season and dry season, you have different kind of the diseases who can come with the seasons. And immediately also we know we have to escape the region where we can have more disease insect or more polluted water in order to protect our own self. So I grew up in these communities where we know the importance of the nature, and when we already included the nexus between environment, human health, and all what we can benefit from both of them. When we protect nature, we protect ourselves. When we want to protect ourselves, we have to protect the nature.
Thanks, Hindu. And I'm so sorry to hear about the challenges that many people in your community have faced. Kinnari, I wanted to follow up because Hindu just shared a very personal story about her community. I remember hearing about the work that you were doing with Health and Harmony years ago. I might have read about it in the Lancet or in some other journal, and I was so amazed. I must have been a med student at the time. And I'm just curious, how did you stumble upon planetary health? And how did you start to connect environmental health and human health? Because it's now more formal part of the dialogue, but not.
I didn't. I grew up in a culture where everyone thinks in silos, and it's how I was trained to think, right? But just as Hindu was describing so exquisitely, her community knows every part of the ecosystem, and they know how everything is interrelated. Human well-being, environmental well-being. In Kalimantan, where I work, the first site around Gunung Palung National Park that we started in, the community there is like, you see that forest there? When it's thriving, the water flows down, it feeds our rice fields, it feeds us. If we're going up into the forest, we're like pushing the disease down, like fully understand these complex ecological understandings that are not really visible to outsiders. Maybe if you studied it for a very, very, very long time, you might come up with the same solution, but I doubt it. So our perspective is radical listening. It means sitting with the communities and asking them what the solutions are, because they know their environment so exquisitely, so beautifully. That level of knowledge and expertise is probably unachievable from outsiders. And besides, you wouldn't want it to come from outsiders. You would want the local communities to identify the solutions and then just support them in those solutions. And that's what we did around Gunung Palung. And you know what? 10 years later, we had a 90% drop in logging households. We stabilized the loss of primary forest, and 52,000 acres of rainforest grew back. Because that's what they wanted. They knew they wanted to protect the forest, and they knew how to do it. And that how was also why we also ended up having a 67% drop in infant mortality. They knew they needed access to high quality, affordable healthcare. They paid for that care with seedlings and manure and all kinds of alternative, creative handicrafts that they made from the forest. And then we also gave discounts to communities for protecting the forest. And the other thing they asked for was training in alternative livelihoods, specifically organic farming. And so that was not from outsiders. We're not telling them, they're telling, this is what we want to learn. We want to learn it because some of the traditional forms of agriculture here just aren't working for us anymore. And we know that other places like Java has a many thousand-year-old tradition of sustainable agriculture. So they asked to be trained in that so we could bring folks over, and it's working. It's working beautifully. We invested over 10 years, $5.2 million. That was like I call it a gift of gratitude from the world to these communities. And what did they give back? Just in counting the carbon, which I don't even really believe in counting carbon, but if you just look at the carbon in just the primary forest, not all that 52,000 acres that grew back, not in the below ground carbon. $65 million worth of carbon is what those communities gave back. It doesn't count water cycling, it doesn't count biodiversity, it doesn't count spiritual value, it doesn't count beauty, it doesn't count all the other values of the forest, right? So, and disease protection. So I just believe we can, if we're truly listening to local communities and following their wisdom, we can heal our planet. Together we can heal it.
Thank you, Kinnari, for sharing that. And Ari, a similar question for you. I first met you in 2007, and I was, as a med student, just so amazed that a Center for Health and the Global Environment existed. And I think you were working on Sustaining Life, that book at the time. I'm just curious your path to understanding as a clinician, that link to the environment, because that's a message we need to broaden.
Well, it's a great question, Neil, but it's particularly humbling to have to answer it in the wake of two experiences that are totally awe-inspiring and compelling about what we need to do. I mean, what is second nature or maybe first nature to Hindu because of how she grew up in the world, and what Kinnari had the open-mindedness to appreciate and cut against what is, I can attest to, a very hard-grained indoctrination of Western education, and particularly medical education, should cause everyone here to take pause. These are extremely powerful experiences and approaches. It's interesting to me that, if you look at Western medicine starting in the early 20th century went on an unprecedented reductionistic win streak. We were able to eradicate diseases, prevent diseases through winnowing understanding of the world to more and more refined, small scale, right? If it wasn't the organ, it was the cell. If it wasn't the cell, it was what's inside the cell, the genes. Now we talk about epigenetic. And it's come at great benefit, but it turns out, and the experiences that we've just heard about make so abundantly clear that there are massive holes in the sieve of reductionism. And so we're left with these problems for health, which are profoundly inequitable in their effects. So in Hindu's community, in the communities that Kinnari works in, it's just radically apparent that the harms are affecting those who have the least to do with the problems. And so we're left with these challenges for which our reductionistic approaches are wildly inadequate to address. And so we have to find the way, and in Climate Week, it's so clear that we, in the richer, whiter, northerner places of the world, need to take heed of the solutions to climate change, not in the strict historic reductionistic sense that we have come to love and know and champion, clearly a place, but we will never get where we need to go by ignoring the reality that we got here through the sieves and the reductionistic pot. And I think that's such a key, what I hear from Hindu and Kinnari is so clear in that regard. And, I got here, I don't quite know how. I mean, I have not had, I have not lived south of the equator or in a low and middle income country for more than a month. I grew up as a kid outside Chicago. If anything, I attribute it to some of the teachers I had who were recognizing back in the 60s that we were never going to address, at that time population growth was a big deal, but that there are a lot of issues arising at global scale which were the consequence of reductionism, and that we would never get there to their solutions through the same approaches. And so that was sort of instilled in me early on that we have to respect different perspectives on issues of concern and recognize and whether it's the voices of indigenous people, whether it's the social sciences writ large, whether it's populations that lack political voice, like children. Like as a pediatrician, I'm always struck at how we talk about children in the United States, and yet when you look at where we behave, how we behave, we don't seem to do that very much. These are things that are critical to our success at meeting the climate challenge, the biodiversity challenge, and I strongly, I hope everyone here is taking good notes of what you're hearing from Hindu and Kinnari.
Thank you, Ari. Hindu, you shared with us very personal experiences from your community. And I was wondering if you could take us to a larger, like more global perspective on how environmental degradation drives inequity in your observations.
Absolutely. So when we talked about generally, as you know, indigenous peoples coming from the 7 socio-cultural regions. And when we say socio-culturals, it is really divided by where we are and with who we have the culture. It is beyond the colonization, because the colonization come and cut as the way that they want, and that's why we have the UN regions separately. But the indigenous regions are before that. And that where we are seeing also indigenous peoples protecting the 80% of the world's biodiversity, because of course we are so surrounding, we are around all the rest of the ecosystem. So you can find from the Himalaya to the Arctic, from the Amazon to all the Congo Basin, or to the Kalahari Desert and all those regions. So where indigenous peoples are living, the ecosystem are much healthier. But with the human impact on climate change and biodiversity loss, we are getting that our land and natural resources shrinking. So we are seeing the impact around all those regions, and they try to change our way of living. When you go around Arctic, and then now we talk about Arctic glacier melting, most of the pictures we have, it is the white bear. People forget about there is the white bears, because there is also the Sapmi peoples or the Inuit peoples who used to live with those bears for thousands of years, and who know where they're hunting and who also hunt with them, who have the rangers and who have all, the sharing of life there. So we need to see the holistic way of the impact of the climate change around all the Arctic, not only in bears, but in the peoples that living depending on it. It is the same when we talk about Amazon and Congo Basin and Indonesia's forest. We put the 3 tropical forests, and then we wanted to reduce the emission on the forest. How about the peoples that living depending of those ecosystems, who are seeing them life impacted in every single days? When we talk about deforestation, cutting the forest around the place, it is not the numbers of the trees or the quantity of the carbons. People are seeing about them livelihood. If they can get fishing around the Rio rivers, if the Rio rivers get polluted, it is going to impact the health of the communities that living there, because they are very far from the hospitals and they depend from the healthier environment. It is the same around the savannas where you come around all my places. We are seeing how the Lake Chad shrink from the 25,000 kilometers squares of fresh water. When just my mother get born, and when I get born, we lost this water to 90%. Actually, now we have about 2,000 or 3,000 kilometers squares of the water from 25,000, imagine. And around this water, it is not only the water that we can take, but it is the fish. It is the biosphere reserve around it, the ecosystem that we are having for our cattle, the medicine we are taking. All those impact creating a conflict between the communities. And those conflicts also are leading to a lot of other crises. A movement of the communities, we can call it maybe migration or whatever, but we call it movement of the populations for us. And when you get like COVID come, maybe COVID is new. When you get just a big cold that come, it affects all the peoples without respecting the frontiers. And of course, we see that maybe COVID is the best pictures, but without respecting any frontiers. From the Himalaya all the to the tropical forest or Arctic, or in my countries, we are getting affected. So that's why from indigenous people's perspective, we must learn from nature. If we harm the nature from one ecosystem, is going to harm the entire ecosystems. And that's how also they cannot get the passport or the frontiers or whatever. So we need to protect where indigenous peoples are living from all those disasters in order to protect our own self. And I think you said well, Aaron, we need to learn from indigenous communities. We are really the front line, we get impacted, but we are so far from becoming victim all time. We are a solutions. We are solution for nature. We are solution for the human health.
Amen.
Thank you, Hindu. Well, to follow up on that, because Hindu, you touched on colonization and the value of indigenous knowledge. Ari and Kinnari, you both have said something similar. Do you feel like, this is a question for all three of you, but is the world ready to listen? We heard the example of Health and Harmony with radical listening, which is such an amazing model. But how often are we seeing models where indigenous wisdom actually people listen to the wisdom of indigenous communities and support indigenous communities in implementing the necessary solutions?
I think we should hear from Hindu first on that one.
Kinnari, I think we need to put the two words separately: listening and then hearing. Are they really listening or hearing us? Because now, since all those last years, when you go to the international conferences, I can start from the last IUCN or from the Food Summit today or from the Climate Week that started a week ago. So you can find many people that is speaking about, yes, we need to protect indigenous peoples land. It is important and whatever. But is it really the time of talking? I don't think so. We are in emergency. We are in emergency of all the planetary health. As human beings, we are only one species of the nature. We are not more than tree or insect or birds or even our dog, our cat. We do have the same rights in this earth. And this is how indigenous peoples are seeing the holistic way. And that's how also we never divided human health or climate change or biodiversity or water or human right or whatever. So we cannot just accept they are talking or saying indigenous peoples are there, they protect the nature, we need to talk with them, we need to put them. We wanted to sit into the decision-making tables. How many indigenous peoples are in the board council of NGOs or companies or government taking the decisions? Very few from the NGOs, we recognize that, and I'm one of them. But from the government, US, only this time, we got one indigenous woman in a big place. How many around all the world do that? No. So that's the things we wanted to be into the decision-making tables to make our voices hear. We don't want people to talk about us. We wanted to talk for ourselves. We don't want them to decide about our knowledge. They cannot talk about us without us. We need to sit in the tables. We have been sitting, I said that yesterday, for so long into the passenger seat. We need the wheel. We need to sit into the driver's seat. And for sure, if we already protecting 80% of the world's biodiversity, that means we have a lot of knowledge. We can drive the peoples, all the humanity in a right place to protect more than 80%, to protect our health, to ensure our food security, not the chemical food, but the sustainable food system, and to ensure the peace with nature. We need to get back in the peace with nature, all of us.
Thank you.
So on the topic of peace with nature, unless Ari or Kinnari, you have anything to follow up.
Nothing more needs to be said. Beautiful. So,
on the topic of peace with nature, right? Many people, like I live in New York City, for example, and at most I might be able to see 5 stars in the sky at night, right? There's so much light pollution. And the reality is that many people in urban settings, now most people in the world live in urban settings, will not have direct access to nature other than maybe parks in the city that they live in. How do we give people that opportunity to have access to nature, to understand their connection to nature, given that not all of us have the means to travel, right? How do we help raise that awareness of our connection to nature?
I sometimes joke that the pandemic was the best thing that ever happened to our planet in this terms, right? Like if any of us ever forgot that our well-being is completely dependent on a healthy planet, right? And things like the fires in California, you can live in a city, but boy, you are going to know that if your air is not good, if your water is not good, if we're not going to make it, right? We are really not going to make it. We are on the edge. This is the decisive decade. We got 9 years to figure this out. And he's exactly right. What we need to do, I feel, is have a connection to indigenous communities, to traditional rainforest communities, and just follow their lead. Just like, we hear you, you're in the driver's seat, we are going, we're in the boat with you, and here's the wheel. Right? Yeah.
So I would subscribe to what you heard from Kinnari in particular on that point. And as a pediatrician, one of the things that I think matters a lot in this issue of how people get connected to nature is what I would call a sensitive period in development. We know that children, for example, have a window of opportunity in their brain development to learn language. So young children, they can learn any language on the planet. They know they can get all the subtleties of sounds and intonations. But it turns out that, by the time you're 5 or 6, that part of your brain sort of closes off. And you start actually, if you learn a new language by the time you're 8 or 10, it doesn't go in your language center anymore. It goes in the part of your brain that stores all the other information you're trying to cram in. You actually can't access this biologically determined magic box of language acquisition. And I would submit that the same is true for understanding nature. I mean, listening to Hindu's childhood experience, it's impossible for people whose livelihoods are enmeshed in the natural world to come out of that childhood and act as so many people in the Western world do, as if nature is here for us to exploit. It would be almost like self-sacrifice, because your identity, your sense of who you are, is so connected to the living world and physical world that But because, again, in the West, we've succeeded with a cultural dynamic that extracts from nature, and we've gotten very successful. Our life expectancies have gone up, our disease burdens have gone down, and so it's very hard for people to say, what's wrong with this? Well, we can point to a lot of things that may be wrong, but for the people who have money and power, it's what's so wrong about this? And so we do have, to Kinnari's point, I mean, we talk about in the context of climate change, the decisive decade in this moment, but the issue is actually more fundamental than that. This is, I think, to what you've heard, the issue in my mind is we're gonna fix climate change. Are we gonna fix it in a way that actually is equitable, in a way that gives our children a future that is what we want, or are we going to drag our feet and take longer? But we're going to have to do something, because it's going to be so bad for so many people that even the rich, powerful people in the reductionistic framework are going to say, we got to do something about this at some point. And I think we're seeing that happening today. I mean, look at what's happening at Climate Week. We have an unprecedented number of commitments of foundations. You have corporations doing more. This is happening. But we need to consider that with the stories we're hearing here, which is, if we really do want a world that's sustainable, one that's good for our children, we can't simply rely on the reductionistic paradigm that has gotten us to where we are today. So what can we learn from folks who've actually lived in harmony with the living world? Because we've forgotten that. People like me, we don't know that anymore. We don't understand it. And getting back to my first point, if you want a climate solution that has durability, it's how do we get our children in experiences that get this sensitive window opened and pushed through, so that there is this sense of a bond with nature. I mean, I've always wanted to do a study in which you look at folks who are behind conservation, who really understand the value of indigenous rights, and folks who never want to be outside and would much rather, nature is really not important. and look at their childhood and really see if they had that opportunity. My hunch is that they didn't, or that nature was seen as a threat more than anything. So sadly, a lot of people in the United States see nature as a threat. It's a place where dangerous things come from. So I think one very durable climate solution, and this is a simple one, I'm a big proponent of, is in the United States, and this is in the United States context, because when Hindu said, are people hearing or are they listening? I'm not sure a lot of folks are yet ready to actually open their ears to this, but finding ways to get this, like schoolyard gardens, are a way for children to understand that nature is here. It requires our attention. It may not work every time the way we want it to, but we can understand it and try and work with it. And of course, in terms of climate, the understanding that we can actually deal with climate risks through, for example, greening cities is a big deal. And there are nutritional aspects to it and exercise, but I try and think of how can we get the folks who are furthest away from where we need to be one step closer. And I think smaller steps like that could be a path forward. If we could do the health and harmony model right now everywhere, I think that would be astounding. I think in particular, for those folks who are here to hear about climate, we have a darndest time getting money spent on conservation. Now, the $5 billion that were announced this week are a major step forward, but even that $5 billion is a fraction of what is spent every year by the US government and by corporations on healthcare. And that's not just in the United States, that's for health system strengthening around the world. So what if we were able to invest in healthcare in a way that invested in the living world around those systems? And oh, by the way, it's much less politically contentious for a taxpayer dollar to go to protecting the health of people who may be at risk, particularly in places in the tropics, of emerging infections, to protect their health, which protects everyone's health, than it is to simply say, let's spend money to protect the forest. And so I really think this paradigm is a critical one right now as we fight to recognize that reductionistic approaches are not going to get us where we need to go. We have established pathways and paradigms like health and harmonies to make sure that we connect human health to the health of the environment. And my hope is that in the climate space, we can recognize that we can be smarter than simply just let's plant some trees, because that idea is the reductionistic paradigm. Let's think about forests. Let's think about the human communities. Let's think about how we can conserve trees in ways that confer more than simply a molecule of carbon. And I think that's one of the messages that's so critical here in this conversation.
Aaron, I jump directly in what you said. Your last sentence is so speaking to me. Don't talk just about forests. It is carbon, because forest or tree, it is more than being just a carbon that we can count. We cannot just plant the tree and say we resolve the climate issues. We have to do it in a right way. For us, one tree, it is of course a leaf. It is a shelter for peoples. It is a home for insects and birds and wild animals. It is for us a food where we can find the fruit or whatever medicine to heal ourselves. It is a love, because you cannot just have a tree without loving the trees that you are benefit from it. So we need to see the solutions that we are planting. It is not the number of the trees that we are counting or the number of the carbon that is going to be sell or whatever is changed through the countries. It is the life that we are really saving, and it is our own life. It is a circular way. And of course, you both say it, Kinari, when we come in the city during the COVID, we understand how the communities can be rely on the nature. In Paris, when they closed down, the lockdown, the first one, they closed all the park, and then you found yourself in an apartment, just like you are locking down, like you are in a prison. At the end of the day, you have nothing else but just having yourself through this home or apartment that we have. It's completely insane. And when they start to going out from the lockdown, most of the people's buying the apartment outside of the city. They wanted to have balcony. They wanted to have garden. They wanted to get connected with the nature. And they understood immediately that as human species, we can do everything, but our life is depend from nature. We depend from the clean air. We depend from the water we drink. We depend from the food. And I saw also how we are depending from the nature. In US, I was watching in the TV, it was a lot of lesson. When they say like no food in the supermarket, how people are running even with the cash in their hand, they cannot buy the food. So if they destroy forests, they can get a cash, they cannot get the food. So they must think about, we need to protect this forest because this is the one who are giving us food in our tables. We cannot make the food just in the air. We can put all the chemicals, but we need the nature in order to put our food in the tables. So this is a big reason. You know, when we grow up, a child in the communities, the first thing that they give you as gift, it's a chicken. When you have 5 years, your chickens, just so you are running after them, they turn into the sheep or goats. And when you are 7 years old, you go after the cattle. So you already have the love to all the animals, you understand. Of course, I cannot advise that people can give them children a chicken in a New York apartment or Paris apartment. It's completely insane or impossible. But they must learn them children, the chicken that they are buying in the supermarket, just like a wing or just like a meat somewhere, they are coming from some animals that grazing in the nature, not in the box as I'm seeing in the Europe, but in the nature. And they can show also them kids that if they are buying even the water in the boxes, the water is not coming from the air, the water coming from the nature. And when they say this water in the bottle, it's have mineral and whatever, those minerals, they're coming from the source. The source are coming from the nature. So to link the daily life of the people in the city with what is they are gaining from the nature every single second. So that can help them to understand they must protect the nature. They must think about what they're buying, if it's impacting negatively or positively the nature, or if they're protecting the indigenous peoples. We are not asking them to take a soldiers allowing us to protect us, but when they buy a sustainable product, that means they're protecting our home, because our home, we take our food from there. We do not take our food from a supermarket, but from our home, we call it a forest.
Thank you all for that. Just so many deep perspectives. And I want to now turn to some of the questions from the audience. We have a question that I'm just going to read. In another presentation I attended recently, the conversation circled around mental health and nature. Can you speak more to the need for a paradigm shift for medicine to include time in nature to be included in a prescription of health?
I can take a first crack at that one.
Seems like as a doctor.
Medical doctor.
So that question came from Pat, and I put a link to an article, Pat, that may be of interest. You may already know about it, but there's more and more evidence, to the point I was making earlier, that children's brains, which we know are incredibly malleable, are actually exquisitely attuned to natural surroundings. And that the absence of exposure to those things actually isn't just a neutral, it's actually bad. And in this paper I sent you, this was in Denmark. So this is in a developed, rich country. They followed almost 1 million children for 10 years. And because the Danish health system is integrated, they could see exactly where these children were living every year. And they knew pretty much everything they needed to know about the families they were living with, the parents, all kinds of social determinants of health. And the bottom line of this study was that the children who grew up in the top quartile, so the top 25% of exposure to green space around their homes, had half the severe mental health diagnoses of the children who grew up in the lowest 25%. And that's accounting for all the things we know that drive mental health outcomes. History of mental health in the family, socioeconomic status, education, so forth. And the more we look into this, the more we seem to realize that there is an independent effect of exposure to nature. Now, what kind of nature is probably important? Because you can imagine we could, surround a child with, one kind of plant, and maybe that wouldn't be as good. We don't know yet. But all said, at the end of the day, there's a real issue we need to address here, which is that depriving children of access to nature may affect their brain development in ways that lead to lifetime harms. Now, there are other ways this can work. We know that mental health is heavily influenced, long-term mental health is heavily influenced by a child's experiences in childhood. So there's a whole field of what is known as adverse childhood events. These are stresses upon children that can come from divorce, it can come from poverty, it can come from abuse, it can come from any number of things. And we know that exposure to nature in adults, in the parents, can buffer against stressors. So you can imagine a pathway where families that are growing up in nature-deprived communities, their parents may be losing one of the buffers they have upon their own stress, and that often gets taken out on the children in ways that affect their brain development. Now, that's a pathway that hasn't been very well explored, but it's totally plausible. And then in even more reductionistic ways, we know that nature matters. So in developed rich countries, air pollution from burning fossil fuels, and this is a big climate link for us, is bad for brains. It's very bad for brains that are already not in the best shape. So people who have dementia, children who have behavioral and other brain-based disorders, air pollution from burning fossil fuels is bad. Trees and other foliage in cities buffer that air pollution. It's not good for the trees, mind you, but it definitely reduces exposure, and that is good for children's brains and their mental health and the health of their parents. So again, this is one of these situations where we can't just look at exposure to nature through a single lens. Exposure to nature in cities matters for the heat people might experience, the air pollution they might experience, the sounds they may hear, because we know sound pollution is an increasing health risk in cities. It matters to potentially the mental health of that child across the lifespan. And of course, trees do sequester molecules of carbon. But again, we often put the horse before the cart. We say the benefits of climate action are to the future. We'll stabilize the climate in 200 years, which is going to save a lot of harm, right? I'm not trying to minimize the fact that climate actions in terms of greenhouse gas reductions are probably the best investment for health we could possibly make. But to this moment, where our brains are biologically focused on, the benefits of climate action are the health benefits that happen today through things like protecting nature, reducing air pollution from burning fossil fuels, potentially to child mental health. And we need to really think about how we talk about climate action in that regard, because the more we focus on the now, the more we focus on how climate actions can benefit the very people who've been harmed the most by our reliance on fossil fuels. And we know that pollution and poverty are bedfellows, right? So the air pollution in the United States, around the world, hits people pretty much based upon where they are in the welfare of the society. And so when you take that pollution away, it has a very good chance of reversing the very inequities that are so much the discourse of our country and the world today. So it's a great question, and mental health, again, is one critical piece which we don't pay enough attention to when it comes to nature-based solutions, particularly for climate.
I'd love to share one little story, which is kind of interesting. So Dr. Monica Nirmala, she's was previous executive director of the program in Indonesia, which has done all this amazing work called Alam Sehat Lestari, 100% Indonesian. So she, after she was at the executive director of ASTRE, she spent some time in India and was at a hospital there. And she was horrified to see that every single week there were multiple people coming in who had tried to commit suicide. And the population was actually even smaller than the region around Gunung Palung National Park, where we have this beautiful forest. And we maybe see 1 or 2 a year people trying to commit suicide. So this was just like really shocking to her. And so she has done radical listening. So she did radical listening in the communities, and she asked them, you know, what's going on here, and what would you all need as a thank you from the world community and try to address these issues? And you know what they said? We need to plant trees. And she was like, what? What do you mean? I mean, I'm talking, you know, this mental health problem. No, we need to plant trees. And they said, because if we plant trees, then there's more water. Water is a huge stress for us right now, getting water. And if we have trees, then we can sit in the shade and rest. And they said, and we all know when we look at a tree, our heart feels calm. And I was just like, wow, okay, here you have these communities who are struggling with this terrible mental health crisis. And you have a world that would like to plant trees. And these are communities who are seeing that as the central solution. Can't we like match these up? You know? Yeah.
We have another question, and this is about the title of our panel, which is the subtitle, which is Thriving People Lead to a Thriving Planet, which is actually the opposite direction than a lot of what we've been talking about. We've talked about how climate change will impact people adversely, or how cutting down rainforests can lead to infectious diseases. Can you all, as panelists, talk more about the other direction, how thriving people leads to a thriving planet?
Hindu?
I think thriving people live to thriving planet. We don't need to talk about it because that's what indigenous peoples do. and of course, that's go directly also to the other question that they ask, what indigenous peoples project doing to protect Mother Earth? So it is the same for me, these questions, because when indigenous peoples are healthiest, our land is safe, protected, for sure, the rest of the species of the nature can live in harmony. Why we are asking, firstly, we need our land collectively, because indigenous peoples do not have an individual land right. We have a collective land rights. And then we say, we wanted to have those land rights collectively protect, and then we fight to protect it. And if our rights as indigenous peoples are protected, so that means those land are absolutely protected. Because what I say, when I started my organizations, I say that I'm going to protect the right of my peoples. That was the first reason. Because when I went to school, I have been very discriminated. I'm like, oh, I'm very lucky. I have to fight for the children of my age to protect their rights. And immediately I understood I can never talk about the rights of peoples without talking about the right of environment. Because we live in the planet. For us, it is the same. So when we thrive the peoples, of course they thrive the planet and they protect the planet. Because that's how we grow up, that's how we get all our educations. It is a circular way. We cannot just choose one and leave the other. It is combined, it has to be together. If you wanted to do thrive planet, you must thrive people, you must thrive planet, and then you can never separate it. It has to turn and turn around. And this is also what we are calling the balance of the nature. Because when you wanted to protect the nature, you cannot just think you have to do the trees, you have to protect the oceans and in silo. It has to be creating the balance of all the species, the balance of human being and the nature. That's also the reason we cannot allow the human being extract from the nature and breaking this balance. So we must give back to the nature and help, help the health of the nature, the health of the human being, all sitting in the circular way. You know, when indigenous peoples having a meeting, you can go around all the communities. We never sit in the pyramid way, like you have the stage here and the other sitting down there. You all sit in rounds, and sitting in round, it's meaning you must include everyone. So you must take the balance. Otherwise you are losing the balance if there is those people in the stage and the others down have just to listen. So we must learn from the nature. And when we learn from the nature, we all thriving our own humanity. And when we thrive the humanity, we thrive the planet.
Thank you, Hindu. We're in our final few minutes, so I wanted to give you all opportunities to give some closing remarks, maybe for 1 minute each. We'll start clockwise on my thing. So we'll go first to Henry. And as you all give your closing remarks, one thing I would love to hear from you all is what gives you hope? We've heard so much about the dire state of the planet, and I'd love to hear also, like, what makes you hopeful about where we're heading? Can we start with you, Kinnari?
Yeah, what gives me hope? Actually, that is exactly what I wrote my book about. The guardians of the trees, local indigenous communities whose knowledge is so fundamental and so absolutely necessary at this stage in the development of our planet. We either follow these incredible leaders or we don't make it, right? And so for me, that is what gives me hope, is to see when we follow, look at the changes that can happen and how rapidly they can happen. So we are actually in the process of setting up what we're calling a rainforest exchange, which will listen to the solutions of rainforest communities and hear them and then actually execute on their solutions, which is to say, totally support their solutions and it's under their direction and control. That is what we're working on. So that's how I feel about you, Hindu. So amazed. It's such an honor to be on this panel with you. Go ahead.
I echo that. And Hindu, let's turn to you next for your closing remarks and hope statement.
Yes, thank you, Kinnari, because this is also what really we are looking for. And this is also what gives me hope. If people understand that we can make all this change and they trust us, that's really give me hope. What you say now, that's give me hope. And of course, indigenous communities around the world who never wait for anyone and continuously fighting for their land, who are acting, protecting the knowledge, protecting all the single ecosystem that we have, that give me really hope. Even people can sit just to talk, we never wait for them, we act. This is a big hope for me. And when I go back home to my community, I'm seeing how they're fighting. Then they give me more energy to come and talk again and say we need to do it because we will make it all together with indigenous peoples.
Yeah.
Thank you, Hindu. Ari.
Wow. I feel that I really going after those two voices is a tall order. I guess I would humbly submit that there are many voices that could be better heard in the world today. And someone asked in the chat, how do we get corporations to really do more? And I think in places like the United States, it turns out that corporations do what we tell them to do. The rules of the game for corporations are dictated by our culture, by our lives. They're not behaving in any way other than the way they've been shown, which means that voice really matters and democracy is precious. And it's so easy to lose sight of. So what gives me hope is that we're in a moment in this country's history, and they don't happen so often, where the voices of the unheard are getting heard more. Now, many of us don't have the kind of access that would be most helpful to getting to where Kinnari and Hindu have so rightly asked us to be, which is an ability to hear from the folks who really understand what sustainability means. We do have opportunities to do that, and it may take more work than it should, but they're there. But there are other voices that can at least keep our minds open to what values are not present in the current way we've structured our society. And I have to say, one of the things that's most inspiring to me in the climate world is the voice of children. These issues are really about, whether it's the climate crisis or the conservation crisis, intergenerational equity. I mean, they're bad enough today, for sure, but they're really about what kind of a world we're leaving. And I've heard from a lot of teenagers and even younger children how clearly they understand the short end of the stick they're getting. And oh, by the way, if people like me could just please get out of the way, we would fix this in a hurry. Because if their voices were heard, they would say, you people don't care about us. And we've heard that. If you really cared about this, you would change the way you're incentivizing people. You would not incentivize corporations to simply look for a profit in the quarterly return. You would make them all B corporations, saying that you have to hold on to ESG principles or you'll be put out of business. Right now, the incentive is if you don't turn a profit, you're fired. It's not going to work, folks. And that's a very hard message to sell, but the bottom line is we can't simply continue to extract from a finite planet and expect that we're going to be okay. Now, we'd like to believe that, as one of my good friends and colleagues, David Mendel, talks about, we can build a technological limb on the tree of life forever. And I wish, and I certainly hope, given what I see now, that that is true. But wouldn't we be better off resting on the natural limbs of the tree of life? And I think we can do that and still, and perhaps really even more so, have a just, more equitable society, a world that's healthier today and good for our children tomorrow. And so I encourage us all to take what we've heard and use it to open our ears to voices that have historically been less apparent to us. And I just can't say how grateful I am again to both Hindu and Kinari for sharing this session, and Neil for the opportunity to join it.
Thank you all so much. Again, to the panelists, you all are incredible, and you all give me hope. I've learned so much in the last hour and in working with you over the past few months. So, and to the audience, thank you so much. I hope you're leaving feeling inspired like I am, and I wish you all the best, and stay safe, please. Thank you.